Thank you very much for being with us, Voices from Oxford. What first excited your interest in Japan and its literature?
Well, as an undergraduate, actually, I was majoring in linguistics, and so I think I sort of drifted into studying Japanese and then slightly later Chinese as well, because I was looking for languages that would be very different from English, essentially. It seemed like an interesting challenge. I think through the process of studying them, I was lucky to have very enthusiastic teachers and very good teachers, and sort of became increasingly fascinated by the writing system, which, as I think is in the case of modern Japanese, is very complex. There's a combination of ways to represent language in terms of symbols that stand for words, and then also symbols that stand directly for sounds, and they're often used kind of flexibly in combinations to write modern Japanese. And that, to me, seemed like a very fascinating system. I was interested in its history and where it came from, and in the sort of way that it maybe allowed different kinds of punning and wordplay. So, through, I suppose, just studying the language, I sort of took a detour into studying, focusing more on Chinese and studying classical Chinese, and so then I encountered, tongue poetry and the works of Confucius, and the sort of things that we think of as maybe the classical Chinese tradition, and was very curious in how those sorts of texts would have been received in early Japan as well, and how they might have been interesting or inspiring to early Japanese writers. So I think the first works of Japanese literature that I really ran into as a beginning sort of postgraduate student were waka poems, which is the sort of dominant form of classical poetry in, for example, the Heian court, through much of Japanese literary history. And it's a very short poetic form. It's only 31 syllables. People might be familiar with haiku, and that's a kind of even shorter poetic form that later developed out of the waka, this form of classical verse. And I found it really fascinating the way that this really compact poetic form, poets sort of over time developed strategies to compress a lot of meaning into each verse by drawing on allusions to other literary works or puns and overlapping language. So I think I took this kind of circuitous route to get here. But
obviously, after studying linguistics, literature, history, it must have been very much easier for you to understand Japanese culture. Is that true?
Maybe. I would like to think, certainly, in terms of what we teach our students here, that, some sort of idea of Japanese history and classical literature sort of it opens a door into aspects of the culture that you might not otherwise be aware of. But, I can't claim to have any sort of perfect understanding of Japanese culture. I think that's a lifelong endeavour. But
how does it compare with Western literature of the same period?
Well, I think we've already discussed a little bit about the fact that named women writers stand out a lot more, and I think that's one of the things that first stood out to me and that I found really fascinating. The fact that you do have, you may have to work a little bit harder to find, for example, women poets in medieval Europe. There are some, but they may have had to overcome more challenges in order to actually have their name be passed down, associated with their work to the present day. Whereas if you look at Heian court culture, there are actually certain types of literary activity were sort of approved for women and were actually considered, a woman who could compose really good waka poetry, or in the realms of other arts, was really skilled at calligraphy, for example. Or in some cases could compose, really compelling prose romances. These were actually skills with some kind of real cultural cachet. So I think this also speaks to maybe a greater place for the arts in court culture, which after all it's a small portion of society at that time. But maybe also somewhat more widespread literacy. and the fact that you have a kind of court bureaucracy that requires groups of literate people that have sort of mastered quite a difficult set of writing systems.
Can you give us some examples of humor and wordplay from the research you've done?
Yes, well, I think I mentioned a moment ago that a lot of Japanese poetic forms actually are very concerned with punning, and the interesting thing is that, at least for the most part, this is considered a kind of form of elegant wordplay. It's not comical. You know, you would think of pun as kind of a low form of humour in English, at least in modern times. But in the case of poetry in classical Japanese, this was more of a strategy to kind of condense overlapping meanings into a small space and give a short poem a lot of meaning and resonance. So I think, the line between wordplay and humour is sort of difficult, and I think the Heian period often is not thought of in narratives of Japanese literary history as a particularly funny period. You can find the beginnings of kind of the medieval anecdotal literature tradition that might collect things that look like folk tales, from outside of the court as well, as sort of comic vignettes about people at court and so on. You can find examples of that going back into the Heian period. And then in one text that I'm very interested in, the Pillow Book of Seishonagon, which was, dates from the sort of mid-Heian court around the same time as the Tale of Genji. There is, at times it might actually be laugh out loud funny, as it were. I think there often is a kind of humour or teasing, which is often based on clever use of literary allusions, in how the author or narrator shows herself, tells sort of diary-like anecdotes about how she managed to kind of tease or foil male courtiers for the most part, by kind of outdoing them in her knowledge of the literary tradition.
Okay, that's very interesting. Is medieval literature still popular in modern Japan?
Well, I think, it may suffer a bit from the fact that it's part of a required curriculum for young people. So classical Japanese is kind of something that you have to study for your college entrance exams and so on. But I think there are elements of classical literature that do seem to still be inspiring a lot of kind of new adaptations and remixes in popular culture today. So there are anime series based on for example, the Yakunin Isshu, which is a collection of 100 waka poems compiled in the early medieval period to kind of show the best work of poets from each era. There recently, just in the past few years, there have been very popular drama series based on the tales of the Heike, or sort of characters related from the which is a big medieval warrior tale, sort of epic. There also, I think I mentioned a few years ago, there was yet another movie based on the Tale of Genji. They sort of come around periodically. So I think, that all perhaps speaks to the power of these texts to continue inspiring people to reinterpret them in new ways. And this is something that I think it's been a living tradition all along. Certainly in the case of the Tale of the Genji, sort of from soon after its compilation, people were coming up with almost their own fan fiction based on it, or finding new ways to illustrate it or translate it into other sorts of media. So it's really a continuation of that.
Has it influenced modern Japanese culture, such as films of Kurosawa or manga, anime?
Yes, I think there are certain sources, and I think I keep coming back to the Tale of Genji, also the tales of the Heike and medieval warrior tales in general, that have very much shaped certain works of modern film and other arts. Often I think through the kind of intervening mediation of early modern adaptations. So I'm not an expert on modern film, but I think some of Kurosawa's work, he's also influenced perhaps by in between by the way that warriors are presented in kabuki drama or sort of other intervening dramatic forms, which themselves took a lot of plots from medieval warrior tales. So I guess again, I mean, it's very much a living tradition that still inspires new work today.
There must be many prospective students who would like to read Japanese at Oxford University. Any tips for them?
Well, I mean, I'd like to encourage, I suppose, any prospective students that are interested in Japan and in what is an intensive but very, very rewarding Japanese course, I think, that gets you to a very high level with classical and modern language and lets you really sort of delve into all sorts of sources in the original language, sort of depending on your area of interest. I think for students who are interested in applying, having some background in a language, it doesn't have to be Japanese, is helpful. It's not strictly required, but it's good to see that, maybe it's good for your own interest to see whether you enjoy grappling with a very different sort of grammar and way of expressing things about the world. Is that something you enjoy learning? And then whatever a student's individual passion to do with Japanese language and culture might be, I would suggest them to pursue it as much as they're able, and then tell us about it in interview, because that's the part that's really interesting and helpful for us to see.
Thank you very much. I've learned a lot from you today.
Thank you.
Thank you for your precious time.
Oh, thank you.